My name is Tom VanLent. I'm a scientist at the Everglades Foundation. When Julie talked to us about doing this presentation, she wanted to get scientific information, and it turns out my scientific background is in hydrology and computational fluid dynamics, which is really boring. So I'm not really going to talk about the things that I like, but instead we're going to talk about Keys water quality, and I'll try to tie it into the perspective of Everglades Restoration, see how they're related. And I'm going to focus on Florida Bay water quality because I'm from the Upper Keys, and we have both reefs and the bay. And understanding, as Billy talked about, the bay and the reef tract do interact, and it's important to understand how they interact, understand how each one works. But the Florida Bay, when you talk about water quality for Florida Bay, I think most of us hear the term water quality and think, oh, that's kind of code for pollution, primarily from nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. You add lots of fertilizers to the water, causes algae to grow, and that causes all kinds of problems. Sucks the oxygen out of the water, blocks light. It's a bad thing. But in Florida Bay, the single most important water quality parameter is salinity. What does the salinity look like? Because Florida Bay is an estuary, so it's a mix of fresh water. Understanding how much fresh and salt water there is at any one time is the key to understanding water quality in Florida Bay. As Billy kind of mentioned, because of upstream changes to the system, Florida Bay's lost well over half of its fresh water, more than half. That's the amount we can document both through modeling and through paleoecological data. That has a profound effect on an estuary that size to lose that much fresh water. So restoring fresh water into this important estuary is the single most important step you can take to protect its water quality and restore the bay. So we'll talk about how that works. Florida Bay gets its fresh water from the upstream Everglades in kind of two major pathways. One is it comes out of the Gulf Coast estuaries, the kind of heart of the Everglades. It comes around Cape Sable and is entrained into Florida Bay through the tidal currents. The other is a secondary overflow from the Everglades into a place we call Taylor Slough, and that enters into central Florida Bay. Those are the two major freshwater sources. Both have been dramatically decreased. Drainage has also moved what freshwater it does get very far east into the bay, and because of the hydrodynamics of Florida Bay, its bathymetry, how the bottom looks, it's very difficult for water that comes in on the east side of Florida Bay near US 1 to move out of that into the central part of Florida Bay. So what you get is events called hypersaline events or hypersalinity events. And they occur primarily in Whipray Basin, if you're familiar with Florida Bay, but it's the kind of middle part of Florida Bay. It's the place that's most starved for fresh water. And so here you see, just in this typical event, typical summertime event, water concentrations of salinity are getting them around 47, 48 parts per thousand. 35, between 32 and 35 is kind of typical seawater. So you see an event that's very much more salty than even seawater. When you go back and compare it as best we can to what is it like before we made all these changes to the upstream system, there's a couple things you notice. One is this is today, the orange, and the bottom line is what we think a typical salinity was pre-drainage. Today, you see that about half the time, the middle part of Florida Bay is much saltier than seawater, 5-6 months out of the year. It was never, and historically, very rarely did it get at seawater. And that's because, and today, the low salinity ranges in about 20 was very much less. So it was also much less variation between the upper end and the bottom end. So it has a very called a mesohaline. It sort of had a certain range of salinities that were very narrow, where today it's much larger. So organisms that were adapted to this sort of range of from fresh to salt have been very stressed. And that is the underlying cause of the problem in Florida Bay. What that has done is create this downward spiral of once you start changing the salinities, you see things like seagrass die off that releases lots of nutrients back into this water column that in turn blocks light, which kills more seagrass, and you get the event that Billy talked about in the early 90s, this sort of widespread collapse of an ecosystem. The primary cause has been this water management system that diverts water away from the Everglades and pumps it out into the estuaries. So it used to work, all the water would flow over the surface of the land, all the way from Orlando through Lake Okeechobee and across the Everglades, about over almost a quarter of our state. This is a big state. Today, with the system of canals, we throw out most of that water to the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries. If you were paying attention to the news this summer, you saw they had a big event, got very wet. They dumped thousands of acre feet, billions of gallons per day of polluted water out the estuaries. Historically, that water would go through the middle part of the Everglades and wind up in Florida Bay. So that's the event. It looked like it's really quite impressive. And you see the system that Billy talked about that, that same water flood control project is why 6 million people can live here, but it also resulted in ecological collapse, loss of the wading birds and of 67 threatened and endangered species, extensive nutrient pollution that we're seeing, but also the effect of fresh water. Now, it happened on just a scale that is regional across pretty much a quarter of the state. But we saw the effects right away here in the Keys. This is sort of an interesting blast from the past. This is water coming down the railroad. Before we had a pipeline, they would put water in the train cars and take it down the train to Key West to augment the cisterns. That was the primary source of water. So my question is, where the heck did they get that water? That's a very interesting question. Well, they got it on, this misspelled, but they got it at Manatee Creek. And if you drive down the stretch, it's right where US 1 crosses the Monroe County line. Today, the notion that that would be fresh enough to drink during April and May is just incredible. I mean, it just boggles my mind. That we saw, it's not just a matter of looking for small tweaks to try to fix Florida Bay. These were fundamental shifts across an entire region, across an entire ecosystem. And so it's not going to be easy to put back. It's going to be very expensive and very difficult to put back. And that's Everglades Restoration. I want to talk about something that I think is very important to me, and that Everglades Restoration got its start in the Keys. It really did. It was that event in 1990, 1992 where Florida Bay collapsed. People got angry. They got mad. There's something they care about was falling apart in front of them, right in front of their eyes. They were outraged. And they launched, remember, it's Florida Bay, stupid? That was the riff on it's the economy, stupid, Clinton. And they recognized right there that what happens in the Keys depends upon what happens upstream. If you don't deal with what happens upstream, we're not going to be able to address the issues here in the Keys. We're at the bottom of the system. And they launched Everglades Restoration. They went to Congress. They demanded action. They got a series of acts passed that and studies started that resulted in the comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. Now that is if you're interested in the actual nuances of that, it's kind of mind-bending because engineers stand up and they talk about all the moving parts, and it's just, I'm an engineer and I have trouble with it. That was passed in 2000 was the final plan. But so rather than talk about the pieces, I'll talk about the overall approach, and it has a couple of steps. One, you need more water in the Everglades. So take all that water that we're throwing away to the estuaries in St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee, clean it up, and send it through to the middle of the Everglades. That's a big step. Next, you got to take out the dams in the middle of the Everglades. They built these because they thought that was how to do it. They took a river, they built a whole bunch of dams in that thinking, well, that'll fix our problem of it being too dry. Well, it didn't. It just starved the bottom end for water. Florida Bay is paying the price. Everglades National Park is paying the price. So once you put more water in, you have to take out the dams. One of those dams is Tamiami Trail, for example. Here's a great picture from the middle of the Everglades, and you can see the difference in water levels from just one lake down to another. That the west side there is deep, flooded, always underwater. On the right side, which is Conservation Area 3B, is parched, burns all the time, is a huge problem. Next is you have to clean the water. You cannot restore the Everglades with dirty, polluted water. No one is planning on that. The part of the plan has to be to make sure that water is cleaned up before it gets into the Everglades. Without that, this doesn't work. This is what happens when you add polluted water into the Everglades. On the left, you see a very healthy Everglades ecosystem. And if you add primarily the limiting nutrient is phosphorus, the entire system changes in profound and fundamental ways. Goes from a very highly productive ecosystem to a monotypic stand of cattails, called the tombstone of the Everglades. 25% of the Everglades is already lost because of this process. And you have to restore the sheet flow. You have to make the Everglades act like the way it used to, because water would fall in the upper end near Orlando and would take all year to get down to Florida Bay. But it would get to Florida Bay just in time, in April and May, and kept those salinities from getting too high. That's part of what we need to do here. You can't just take water and dump it anywhere in Florida Bay at the wrong time. You have to use the Everglades the way it used to work, so it would arrive there at the right time of year in the right quantities. And when you do that, you can restore the Everglades. I want to talk about one plan. I unfortunately left my cell phone at home, but the Corps is meeting on this. We'll see how this goes. But it's called the Central Everglades Planning Project. It's one that we're trying to get passed through Congress. And it has all these pieces. And it has a significant effect, a significant beneficial effect for Florida Bay. It adds more water. It removes barriers to flow. It puts water back into Florida Bay in the right places at the right time. It follows the recipe. It does what we need it to do. So in summary, for Florida Bay, the part of the bay, or part of the Keys that's most dependent on the Everglades for fresh water, the single most important water quality parameter there is salinity, and it's the need for fresh water. Increasing the amount of fresh water is the essential step in recovering and restoring and protecting Florida Bay. Without fresh water, we're going to continue to have these events we saw in the past 30 years or so. It's not going to change. It won't heal itself. Fresh water is what we need. Everglades Restoration, projects like SEP, are the pathway to get us that water. So with that, thank you very much. We'll turn it over to Bob.